The storm had come without warning, rolling in from the western mountains like an angry beast unleashed. Dark clouds swallowed the late afternoon sun, and within minutes the forest that had been calm and golden with autumn light turned into a labyrinth of shadows, howling wind and stinging rain. Trees groaned as the gale bent their limbs, branches snapped like bones, and the sky pulsed with jagged white lightning that tore across the heavens. In the chaos of that storm, two small figures stumbled through the forest floor. They were twins, no older than 7, their tiny bodies shivering in soaked deerskin tunics. The boy clutched a woven pouch, half filled with crushed berries, while the girl held his hand so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. Each time thunder rolled, they flinched, their dark eyes searching the trees as if monsters lurked behind every trunk. Hours earlier, the twins had followed their tribe into the woods, a simple foraging trip meant to fill baskets before winter's teeth sank deep into the land. But the storm had scattered them like leaves, and the children, straying too far from their mother's side, found themselves alone, swallowed by the endless maze of cedar, pine, and fir. The rain blurred every track, every path. Now all they could do was walk, clinging to each other as the forest grew more merciless with every step. A jagged cedar, half split by lightning, became their shelter for a brief moment. The boy pulled his sister beneath its broken arms, trying to shield her from the storm's fury. The smell of burnt wood and resin stung their noses, and the girl whispered prayers in their language, soft, trembling words asking the spirits of the forest for guidance. But the storm did not listen. It was then that the boy noticed something through the curtain of rain. A faint, flickering light, low and steady, unlike the wild blaze of lightning. His heart skipped. Fire. Where? There was fire. There might be people. His sister looked up at him, her face wet not just from the storm but from tears. Without speaking, he tugged her hand, and they stumbled forward toward the glow. The light led them deeper into the woods, past fallen logs and swollen streams that hissed as rain pelted them. At last, through a cluster of towering firs, they saw it clearly. A campfire burning stubbornly against the storm. Its orange flames licked upward, sparks rising like fireflies. Beside it, a giant silhouette moved, larger than any man they had ever seen. His shoulders seemed as broad as tree trunks, his beard wild and thick like tangled roots, and in his massive hands gleamed the long, polished handle of an axe. The children froze. Every tale they had heard about the lumberjack of the northern woods rushed back at once, stories told by the elders around the fire. Some said he was a spirit, half man, half beast, who cut down trees not for wood but for vengeance. Others said he was a giant who had been banished from the towns because his strength frightened even the bravest men. To the children, he was both terrifying and magnificent, a mountain of flesh and steel, his very presence commanding the storm to bend around him. For a long moment the twins dared not move. The boy wanted to pull his sister back, to hide, but her small body shook violently in the cold, and he knew they could not survive the night without warmth. Summoning courage he did not feel, he stepped forward, pulling her with him. The lumberjack turned. His eyes, glinting in the firelight, narrowed at the sight of 2 soaked children emerging from the shadows. His axe hung at his side, gleaming like a predator's fang. The air itself seemed to pause. The storm's howl muted, the fire's crackle dimmed, as the twins stood before the giant. The girl found her voice first. It came out as a whisper, trembling but desperate. "Please, help us." The lumberjack did not answer immediately. His gaze shifted between the children. 2 fragile beings, no higher than his waist, their faces pale with fear yet lit with a quiet determination to survive. He had seen wolves in the snow stronger than them, yet none as haunting. The boy's hand clutched his sister's tightly, as though letting go would mean death. In that instant, the lumberjack faced a decision he had not expected: to ignore them and remain the solitary figure the world believed him to be, or to open his fire, his shelter, and his life to the tiny strangers who now looked at him as their only hope against the raging storm. And though neither child could know it, their plea was the first spark of a chain of events that would shake not only the lumberjack's fate, but the entire town beyond the forest, for his choice made in that storm would echo in ways no one could yet imagine. The fire hissed as the rain pattered against the circle of stones surrounding it. Smoke curled upward, fighting against the storm winds, and the giant lumberjack stood as immovable as a boulder, his axe resting across his massive palm. His silence alone seemed enough to crush the fragile courage of the two soaked children before him. The twins clung to each other, trembling. The boy, though no older than 7, tried to stand tall, as if by squaring his shoulders he could shield his sister from the stranger's imposing shadow. But the lumberjack's size was overwhelming. His shoulders loomed like the trunks of oak, and his beard dripped with rain, giving him the wild look of a creature carved out of the forest itself. The girl pressed herself against her brothers, sighed, her lips moving as if shaping words she could not yet say. Finally, her voice broke through, a whisper carried on a breath of desperation. "Please, help us." The lumberjack tilted his head slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing in the flickering light. For a heartbeat, he did not move. Then, in a voice deep and rough as gravel dragged across stone, he asked, "Why are you here?" The boy's lips trembled, but he forced himself to speak. We got lost. From our people. The storm, it came fast. We don't know the way." The lumberjack's gaze hardened. He had heard stories about the native families who camped in the far valleys, moving with the seasons, hunting, gathering. The townsfolk spoke of them with disdain, calling them wilds and wanderers. He had stayed out of it, the disputes, the whispers, the prejudice. But now, 2 children from that very people stood dripping before his fire, their voices pleading for the thing most men in town would refuse them: mercy. The girl's voice broke through again, her tone sharper now, carrying both fear and urgency. "They came for us. Men from the town. They took others. Mama said to run. We ran, but we can't find her." The lumberjack's brow furrowed. His grip tightened on the axe handle, the wood creaking under his strength. Men from the town. He knew exactly what that meant. The mayor and his circle often sent hunters into the forest, under the excuse of protecting land. But beneath it all, everyone knew it was greed, land disputes, hatred, and the hunger for power. And now, that hunger had stretched its claws toward children. The fire crackled louder as silence stretched between them. The boy swallowed hard and stepped closer, his chin trembling but his eyes steady. "You're strong," he said, almost accusingly. "Stronger than anyone. Will you help us? Please, we don't know where else to go." The lumberjack studied him carefully. It was not the plea of a weakling. The boy's voice, though frightened, carried something else: defiance. A spark of courage that should not have lived in one so small. And beside him, the girl gripped her brother's hand so tightly it was as though she was anchoring herself to him, refusing to be torn away. The lumberjack drew in a slow breath. Every part of him wanted to turn away, to remain the solitary giant that the world already believed him to be. For years, he had lived alone, carving his existence out of wood and silence, avoiding entanglements that might drag him back into the noise of men and their endless cruelty. But here they stood, 2 lives dangling by a thread, and for reasons he could not explain, the thought of leaving them to the storm weighed heavier than his axe ever had. He bent slightly, lowering himself until his massive frame seemed a little less terrifying. His voice rumbled, quieter now, but still as steady as thunder in the distance. "Come closer to the fire. Warm yourselves." The twins hesitated, exchanging a wide-eyed glance. But the cold gnawed at their bones, and their fear of freezing outweighed their fear of him. Slowly, cautiously, they edged toward the flames, crouching near the stones where the warmth licked their numb fingers. The boy coughed, his thin chest shuddering with each breath. The girl leaned against him, her eyelids heavy with exhaustion. The lumberjack remained silent, watching them. Their small bodies seemed so fragile, so out of place in this storm. And yet, beneath the frailty, there was a stubborn will, a refusal to give in, even as the world conspired against them. At last, the girl lifted her head and whispered again, "Will you keep us safe?" The question pierced him deeper than he expected. Safety was a promise he had not made to anyone in years. Safety meant responsibility, meant stepping into battles he had long avoided. His silence stretched once more, but this time it was not the silence of indifference. It was the silence of a man caught between the life he had chosen and the duty that now demanded to be heard. The storm raged outside, branches snapping, wind howling like wolves in the night. The lumberjack knew then that the storm was not the greatest danger these children faced. The real storm was men, greedy, merciless men who would stop at nothing to claim what they believed was theirs. The storm eased by dawn, though the forest still groaned beneath its passing. Heavy drops slid from pine needles, and the air carried that damp, raw scent of earth torn open by rain. Inside the clearing, smoke rose lazily from the lumberjack's fire, and the twins sat wrapped in a wool blanket that hung from his cabin wall. Their tiny forms looked even smaller within its folds, their dark eyes darting between the flames and the massive figure who moved about the camp with slow, deliberate strength. The lumberjack had not spoken much since allowing them to stay. He tended the fire, chopped wet wood into neat stacks, and laid out food, bread baked days before, smoked venison, and a clay pot of broth he reheated over the flames. His silence was not cruel but heavy, like a boulder pressing against the air. The children did not know what to make of him. They had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. In the nearest town, a place called Ironwood, where loggers, traders, and hunters lived hard lives, the giant lumberjack was spoken of in whispers. His real name, Elias Brandt, was rarely used. To most, he was simply the beast of the North Woods. Parents warned their children that if they strayed too far, the beast would snatch them up. Hunters claimed they'd seen him fight a bear with nothing but his axe, splitting it down in one swing. Others said he had once felled an entire grove of cedar in a single day, his strength unnatural, his endurance endless. But behind every story was a darker shadow. A man who did not belong, who lived apart because he could not be trusted. No one truly knew why Elias had chosen exile in the woods. Some whispered he had killed a man in a tavern brawl, splitting his skull clean. Others said he had once worked in the town's sawmill until his temper drove him out. A few insisted he had been a soldier, cast away after the war for crimes too grim to name. Whatever the truth, the image stuck. Elias Brandt was a danger, too big, too strong, too silent. He was the kind of man who made others feel small just by standing in the same room. And so the town treated him like a loaded rifle, best kept far, far away. The children didn't know all the details, but they had felt the weight of those whispers. And now here they were, sitting before the very man their mothers told them to fear. Yet strangely, the terror they expected did not come. As Elias moved about the camp, there was a steadiness in him, a strange rhythm. Every swing of his axe was measured, precise. When he returned to the fire, he crouched down, his giant hands surprisingly careful as he broke bread and handed it to the twins. The girl stared at the offering for a moment before taking it, nibbling cautiously, as though half expecting it to vanish. The boy, hungry and wary, tore into his piece, but kept one eye on Elias the whole time. The silence stretched until the boy could not hold back any longer. "Why does everyone fear you?" he asked bluntly, his small voice breaking the stillness. Elias's eyes, sharp as flint, lifted from the flames. For a long moment he did not answer. Then, with a grunt, he turned his gaze back to the fire. "Because men fear what they cannot control," he said at last, his voice low, rough as timber. The boy frowned, not fully understanding. The girl leaned closer to her brother, whispering, "He's different. That's why." Elias glanced at her. A strange softness flickered in his eyes, there and gone in a heartbeat. "Different," he repeated quietly, as though testing the word on his tongue. In truth, Elias did not mind the fear. Fear kept people away. It was safer that way, for him, and perhaps for them too. But now, with two small strangers eating, by his fire the wall he had built with silence and solitude began to show cracks. The children spoke again, their voices weaving into the morning air. They told him of their mother, of the way she had pushed them to run when men from the town came into their camp with rifles and rope. They spoke of others who had been captured, dragged away to the sound of crying and shouting. Elias listened, his jaw tightening with every word. He knew the town's men, greedy, proud, quick to violence. It was easy for them to see the native families as less than human, easier still to justify cruelty when cloaked as protection. But these children were no threat. They were small, fragile, and afraid. Yet here they were, telling their story with a courage that shamed most grown men. The boy finished his bread and looked Elias squarely in the eyes. "You're strong, stronger than them. You could help us." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Elias did not respond immediately. His silence was his shield, a way to keep himself from the entanglements of other lives. But inside, something stirred. It was not pity, nor obligation. It was something older, buried deep, a memory of what it felt like to stand for someone else, to use his strength not for himself, but to shield the weak. He had buried that part of himself long ago, yet now, staring at two fragile souls who had no one else, Elias Brandt began to feel the weight of a choice pressing down on him. For the first time in years, the giant lumberjack wondered if his reputation was not a curse, but a weapon, one that could be turned against the very men who had taught the children fear. And in that wondering, the first threads of decision began to tighten. The forest lay heavy under the weight of night. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the dripping branches and the broken hush of the woods. A cold mist drifted between the trees, curling around the cabin where Elias Brandt sat in silence, the firelight casting his hulking shadow across the walls. The twins slept near the hearth, wrapped in a wool blanket too big for their small bodies. Their breathing was uneven, marked by soft whimpers and the restless twitch of dreams filled with fear. Every so often, the girl would reach for her brother's hand, and even in sleep, he would grip it tightly. Elias leaned forward on his chair, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the fire. The flames crackled, sparks leaping upward like fleeting stars, and he felt the familiar weight of his axe against the wall behind him. His hand twitched, as though it longed to reach for the handle, not to swing it at wood, but at the thoughts gnawing inside his skull. He knew what the children had asked of him. He had heard the tremble in their voices, seen the naked terror in their eyes when they spoke of men from the town dragging their people away. He knew the truth of it, too. Ironwood's leaders had long resented the native families who lived in the valleys and forests. They spoke of protecting resources, but what they meant was power, land, and control. They wanted the forest cleared, the rivers claimed, and the people gone. Now, two of those people were asleep in his cabin, fragile, innocent, desperate, and they had asked him to be their shield. Elias's jaw tightened. He had spent years building a wall between himself and the world. Alone, he had no responsibilities, no voices to silence but his own, no attachments that could be broken. The world had given him names: beast, monster, brute, and he had accepted them because keeping his distance meant keeping his peace. But now their small faces haunted him. The boy's blunt words replayed in his mind. "You're strong, stronger than them. You could help us." And the girl's whisper, softer but sharper than any blade. "Will you keep us safe?" He pushed away from the chair, rising to his full, towering height. The cabin creaked under the weight of his steps as he moved to the door. He opened it, letting the icy night air wash over him, and looked out into the blackened forest. The mist curled like ghosts. Somewhere out there, men carried rifles, torches, and cruel intentions. Somewhere out there, the children's mother might be shackled, their people suffering. He could close the door, pretend it wasn't his fight. By dawn, the children might wander off again, or worse, the town might come and take them. Either way, he could choose silence, solitude. The easy road he had always walked, but Elias knew himself too well. If he turned away now, the faces of the twins would follow him until his last breath. Their voices would echo in every strike of his axe, every empty night by the fire. To ignore them would be to carve a scar into his own soul, deeper than any wound his enemies could inflict. Behind him, the boy stirred in his sleep, coughing softly. The girl whispered something unintelligible, clutching her brother's hand tighter. Elias turned, his sharp eyes softening as he watched them. They were so small, yet their presence filled the cabin in a way he had not felt in years, perhaps ever. Slowly, Elias crossed the room. His massive hand hovered for a moment above the blanket before he pulled it gently higher over their shoulders, tucking them against the cold. The simple act, so foreign to him, carried more weight than swinging an axe or felling a tree. It was a vow unspoken. He straightened and walked to the corner where his axe leaned. His hand closed around the handle, the wood worn smooth by years of use. Lifting it, he felt the familiar balance, the surge of power it carried. But tonight, it felt heavier, not because of the steel, but because of the choice it symbolized. The choice was made. Elias would not abandon them. He stepped back to the fire, the axe resting easily across his shoulder, and lowered himself to the chair once more. His eyes remained fixed on the flames, but his ears stayed sharp, listening for every shift in the night, every distant sound that might mean danger was coming. When morning arrived, he would lead them. He did not yet know whether deeper, into the forest, to find the remnants of their tribe, or against the very men who hunted them. But one truth was clear as the crackle of the fire and the beat of his own heart. The morning broke pale and gray, the storm clouds drifting eastward, leaving the forest damp and quiet. Mist clung low to the ground, curling around the roots and trunks like a living thing. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, sharp and clean, but beneath that freshness lurked a stillness that was not peace. It was anticipation, the kind that prickles the skin before danger reveals itself. Elias Brandt moved with a steady rhythm, as he packed what little he owned into a canvas sack: smoked venison wrapped in cloth, a flask of water, a heavy wool cloak. His axe, polished by use and rain, never left his side. He did not explain his preparations to the twins, and they did not question him. They simply watched with wide eyes, their small bodies huddled together by the fire, as though afraid that if they looked away, he might vanish and leave them to the wilderness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. "We moved today. Staying here will draw them to us." The boy straightened, trying to show bravery though his lips trembled. The girl clutched his arm. Neither fully understood where them were, but they remembered the rifles and the shouting and the cruel laughter when their people were dragged away. That memory alone was enough to make their hands tighten around each other. Elias opened the door and scanned the tree line. The forest was calm, the mist thick, the silence deep. But he knew better than to trust silence. Silence in the woods was a mask. And often, it was the mask worn by predators. What he did not know was that the mask already hid a watcher. Far to the west of the cabin, crouched in the underbrush, a lone hunter adjusted the scope of his rifle. His breath steamed in the cold morning air as his eyes tracked the movements around the lumberjack's cabin. He had followed the twins' trail since the storm, his sharp gaze trained on the tiny prints in the mud, the broken twigs, the faint marks left behind. Hunters like him had been paid well to find stragglers, those who slipped away when the townsmen came to seize the tribes. For every captive returned, there was reward. For children, the price was higher. But these two weren't alone. The hunter's jaw tightened as he saw the hulking shape of Elias Brandt step into the clearing. Few men in Ironwood spoke the giant's name without spitting. Even fewer would dare cross him. But now, here he was, sheltering the very children the town wanted contained. The hunter's lips curled into a thin smile. This was more than a prize. This was glory. If he returned to town having bested the beast of the North Woods and delivered the captives, his name would be etched in every tavern tale for years to come. He crouched lower, adjusting the strap of his rifle, waiting for his chance. Back at the cabin, Elias led the children outside. The mist clung to their small frames, making them seem ghostly against the towering trees. The boy carried nothing but determination in his eyes, while the girl clung to her brother's sleeve with each step. Elias's massive figure dwarfed them both, his axe glinting faintly in the dim light. "Stay close," he rumbled, guiding them along a narrow path leading deeper into the forest. His senses sharpened with every step, the way the birds had not yet returned to their morning song, the way the underbrush seemed disturbed. He had lived long enough in the woods to know when eyes were upon him, and indeed they were. The hunter shadowed them silently, his boots muffled against the damp ground. He kept his distance, watching, waiting. To charge recklessly would be suicide. The lumberjack's size promised brute force beyond reckoning, but patience was a hunter's greatest weapon, and patience would deliver these children into his grasp. Deeper they went into the forest, the heavier the air grew. The children did not see it, but Elias did. The faint shift of branches where none should move, the glint of metal just for a heartbeat swallowed by mist. He said nothing to the twins, but his grip on the axe handle tightened. Hours passed in uneasy silence, every sound magnified. The snap of a twig, the whisper of leaves, the faint scuff of boots against wet earth. Elias's instincts screamed at him. They were not alone. As the sun struggled to pierce the fog, the boy tugged Elias's sleeve. "Someone's there," he whispered, though he had seen nothing. Fear sharpened children's senses too. Elias gave no reply, but his eyes swept the trees like a hawk, and then a flash, the unmistakable gleam of rifle steel. The hunter had decided to show himself. He stepped from the shadows, tall and lean, his rifle raised but not yet aimed. His grin was wide and cruel. "Well, well," he called, his voice cutting through the mist like a blade. The beast himself playing nursemaid. Never thought I'd see the day. The children froze, clutching each other's hands, their small bodies shaking. Elias stepped forward, planting himself firmly between them and the hunter, his axe gleaming in the pale light. The hunter smirked, tilting his rifle casually. "You know how this ends, Brandt. Those two belong to Ironwood now. Step aside and maybe I'll let you keep that ugly cabin of yours." Elias said nothing. The firelight from the cabin had faded, but a darker flame burned in his eyes. The silence stretched. Mist swirled. And in that heavy pause, one truth became clear. The hunter was no longer stalking prey. He had stepped into the den of a bear. The mist hung thick, muffling the world to a shallow breath and a heartbeat. The hunter's rifle gleamed cold and hungry in the pale light, its muzzle trained loosely but deliberately in Elias Brandt's direction. Behind him, the children clung together, their eyes wide with terror, their little chests rising and falling too quickly. Elias stood unflinching, his massive frame a wall of flesh and iron between the hunter and the twins. His axe rested in his hands, its steel head darkened by years of use, the edge gleaming with a dangerous promise. He did not raise it. Not yet. The hunter smirked, his voice carrying the false ease of a man who thought himself already victorious. Big man like you, Brandt, ought to know when a fight's already lost. Those brats don't belong here. They'll come with me, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you keep your skin. But cross me, and I'll put you down like the dog you are. Elias's eyes narrowed, his voice low and thunderous. You'll touch them over my corpse. The hunter's grin widened. Gladly. In a breath, the rifle snapped upward, the barrel locking on Elias's chest. The children screamed, their small voices piercing the mist. But Elias moved first. His body, despite its size, surged forward with terrifying speed. The axe swung wide, not at the hunter's head, but at the ground. The steel blade smashed into the earth with explosive force, sending up a spray of mud and stones that shattered the hunter's aim. The rifle cracked, the shot going wild into the trees, sparking against bark. Before the echo of gunfire died, Elias closed the distance. The hunter swung the rifle like a club, catching Elias across the shoulder with a bone-jarring blow. Elias grunted, staggered a half-step, but his grip did not falter. With a roar, he yanked the axe free from the ground and swung. The hunter leapt back, the blade missing his chest by a hair's breadth, carving a clean line through the mist instead. The hunter was quick. He dropped the rifle, drawing a hunting knife from his belt, the blade narrow and wicked. He slashed upward, aiming for Elias's throat. The lumberjack caught his wrist with one massive hand, the strength in his grip like iron shackles. The hunter's face twisted with pain as Elias squeezed, the knife clattering from his grasp. But the hunter was no stranger to fights. With his free hand, he drove a fist hard into Elias's jaw. The giant's head snapped sideways, blood springing on his lip. The twins gasped as Elias released the wrist, stumbling a step back. The hunter lunged for the dropped knife, scooping it up and slashing wildly. Steel-kissed flesh, Elias's forearm raised in defense, took the cut. Blood trickled down into his palm. The pain only awakened the beast. Elias bared his teeth, eyes blazing like coals in the mist. He swung the axe in a brutal arc, the hunter ducking at the last second, the blade slicing a tree trunk behind him. Wood splintered violently, the massive cedar groaning as if crying out. The force of the blow alone shook the ground, reminding the hunter just who and what he was facing. The hunter lashed out again, stabbing for the children this time. His intent was cruel and sharp. If he couldn't break the giant with steel, he would break him with fear. But Elias was faster. With a bellow, he surged forward, shoulder first, slamming into the hunter's chest. The man was lifted off his feet, hurled backward into the mud with the weight of a falling tree. His knife flew from his hand, spinning into the grass. The hunter gasped, wind knocked from his lungs, scrambling desperately for air. Elias loomed above him, axe raised high. For a heartbeat, the world froze. The children holding their breath, the hunter's eyes wide in dawning terror. The beast of the north woods had him, and one swing would end it. But Elias hesitated. The children were watching. Their tiny eyes clung to him, filled not with fear of the hunter but of him. They had seen men kill before. They had seen cruelty. But what would they see now? A protector or another monster? The axe trembled in his hands. Then, slowly, Elias lowered it. Instead of steel, he used his boot. With one crushing step, he pinned the hunter's chest to the earth, leaning his enormous weight down until the man gasped in agony. "Go back to your masters," Elias growled, his voice like thunder breaking stone. "Tell them the beast you. Fear will tear down the forest itself before he lets you touch these children again." The mist still clung to the forest as Elias trudged back toward his cabin, the twins clutching his enormous hands, one on each side. The ground was soft from the struggle, mud sucking at their boots, but their little legs kept up with him, perhaps fueled by the stubborn trust only children could carry. Elias's arm ached where the hunter's knife had bitten flesh, blood seeping sluggishly beneath his sleeve. He ignored it. The twins' safety outweighed the sting of any wound. Still, their eyes kept flicking up to him wide with concern. "You're hurt," whispered the boy, his voice timid, barely audible above the creak of branches. "I've known worse," Elias rumbled. His voice was meant to sound reassuring, but it came out like distant thunder, deep, raw, and rough. The boy flinched at the tone, though not the words, and Elias cursed himself silently. He had spent so long alone, his speech had grown more bark than balm. When they reached the cabin, Elias pushed the heavy wooden door open, its hinges groaning like some tired beast. The twins hesitated at the threshold, peering into the dim interior. The place smelled of pine and wood smoke, its walls lined with shelves stacked with rough-hewn tools, jars of herbs, and piles of firewood. A single massive bed of furs dominated one side, while a hearth glowed faintly on the other. "Go on," Elias said, stepping aside. "It won't bite." The girl squeezed her brother's hand, then led him inside. Their small feet padded softly against the wooden floor, their eyes darting everywhere at once. To them, it must have seemed like stepping into the lair of a giant. Everything was oversized. The chairs, the mugs, even the tools hanging on. The walls. Elias lit the fire properly, coaxing the embers into a living flame. Warmth spread quickly, banishing the chill of the mist. He knelt by the hearth, pulling off his torn shirt sleeve to examine his arm. The cut was deep, but not mortal. Still, infection was a cruel enemy in these woods. He reached for a jar of ground herbs and began to work the poultice in with practiced motions. The children watched in silence until the girl spoke. "Why didn't you kill him?" Her voice was soft but direct, carrying a wisdom beyond her years. Elias paused, staring into the flames. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, finally, his deep voice rolled out. "Because monsters kill without thought. I won't be one of them, not in your eyes." The girl lowered her gaze, perhaps unsure what to make of his words, but her brother shifted closer, as though reassured by them. Elias caught the movement in the corner of his eye and felt something stir in his chest, something warm, something long buried beneath scars of loneliness. "Sit," Elias said, motioning to the fur-covered bench near the fire. "Warm yourselves." The twins obeyed, huddling together as the firelight painted their faces gold. Their eyes grew heavy, exhaustion from fear and flight finally settling upon them. Elias busied himself with boiling water, stirring in dried roots and bark until a bitter, earthy aroma filled the cabin. He poured the steaming liquid into a wooden cup, handing it first to the boy, then another to the girl. "Drink. It'll put strength back in your bones." They sipped hesitantly, but soon enough the warmth spread through their small bodies, their shoulders relaxing. As they drank, Elias studied them quietly. Their faces were thin, their clothes ragged and too small. They carried no possessions, no sign of kin, only each other. Something tightened in Elias's chest. They were so fragile, yet they had survived this long. And now, by some cruel twist of fate, they were his responsibility. When their cups were empty, the boy yawned so wide his jaw cracked. Elias allowed himself the faintest smile. He lifted them, one in each arm as easily as carrying twigs, and set them down on his bed of furs. The twins clung to each other instinctively, curling up like two sparrows in a nest. "You'll sleep here tonight," Elias said, adjusting the furs over them. "I'll take the chair." The girl's eyes blinked slowly, heavy with fatigue. Will they come back?" Elias met her gaze. His voice, though still rough, carried a solemn oath. "If they do, they'll find me waiting." The girl nodded faintly, comforted. Within moments, both children were asleep, their small breaths mingling in the stillness. Elias settled into the massive chair near the fire, his axe resting across his knees. His arm throbbed, but he ignored it. Instead, he watched the twins as they slept, their faces soft and innocent, untouched by the horrors of the world for at least this one night. For years, Elias Brandt had lived as a shadow, feared and despised, his heart buried beneath solitude. Yet tonight, as the flames danced and the children slept under his roof, he felt something stir inside him. Not fear, not guilt, something different. Perhaps, he thought, this was what it meant to be human again. By dawn, the forest had quieted. Smoke from Elias's chimney curled skyward, a sign of life that had gone mostly unnoticed for years. But down in the town, the story of what had unfolded in the misted pines was already spreading like wildfire. A hunter staggered into town at sunrise, his pride as battered as his bruised face. He told a tale of being overpowered by the giant, Lumberjack, of losing his knife, his quarry, and his dignity in a single encounter. At first, the townsfolk laughed, assuming his story was a cover for cowardice or drunkenness. But when he swore on his own blood that the lumberjack had sided with native children, the laughter curdled into uneasy silence. By midday, the whispers had reached every corner of the settlement. "Did you hear? Elias Brandt is hiding savages in his cabin. They say he fought one of our own to protect them. A man like that. Maybe he's finally lost his mind." Shopkeepers muttered behind counters, mothers pulled their children closer, and farmers shook their heads with suspicion. Yet not all voices were hostile. There were those who remembered Elias before tragedy had turned him into a recluse, a man who once stood shoulder to shoulder with neighbors, felling trees, raising barns, building lives. "He always had a good heart," one old woman said, squinting as if recalling the ghost of a younger man. Maybe the twins needed him more than we do. But suspicion outweighed sympathy. Fear of the unknown always ran deep in frontier towns, and the mere idea of outsiders, native blood no less, being sheltered within the borders gnawed at nerves already frayed by hardship. By evening, a group of men gathered outside the tavern, their voices sharp with anger. The hunter who had clashed with Elias nursed his wounded pride with whiskey, urging them on. "That giant's gone rogue," he spat. "First he abandons the town, now he betrays it. Mark my words, those twins will bring trouble on all of us. If we don't deal with him, we'll be the ones paying the price." His words fanned the embers of resentment. Some agreed eagerly, muttering about keeping the town safe. Others hesitated, shifting uneasily, unwilling to raise arms against a man who had once been their own. Still, by nightfall, the decision was made. A delegation would march to Elias's cabin at dawn to demand answers. Back in the cabin, Elias had little sense of the storm brewing below. He busied himself with chores, splitting firewood one-handed, his injured arm bandaged tightly. The twins followed him like shadows, timid but curious. They asked questions about the tools, the forest, the jars of herbs that lined the shelves. For the first time in years, Elias found himself speaking more than a handful of words at a time. The boy asked why he lived alone. Elias didn't answer directly, not yet. Instead, he gave them work to do, stacking kindling, fetching water, stirring the pot simmering over the fire. It wasn't much, but their laughter, soft, uncertain, and fleeting, began to echo against the cabin walls that had known nothing but silence for so long. Yet as the sun dipped behind the trees, Elias felt unease gnawing at him. He knew the hunter would not suffer his humiliation quietly. The man's spite was dangerous, and Elias had lived long enough among men to recognize the speed at which anger could turn into mobs. That night, as the twins lay curled on the furs once again, Elias sat by the fire with his axe in hand, eyes locked on the door. Memories returned unbidden. The day his own family had been torn from him by sickness, the cold stares of townsfolk who treated his grief as weakness, the long years of exile he'd endured in these woods. Now, against all logic, he found himself standing at a crossroads. Protecting the twins meant drawing the fury of the town. Sending them away meant betraying the fragile trust they had placed in him. The fire crackled, shadows leaping across the walls. Elias stared into the flames, jaw set. He knew the choice was no longer his alone. Fate had already set the wheels in motion. By morning, the town would come, with questions, with demands, maybe with weapons. And when they did, he would stand between them and the children. Whether the town remembered him as a neighbor, a monster, or a savior, that would be for them to decide. But Elias Brandt had made his vow. No harm would come to the twins while he still drew breath. Morning broke with a pale gray light that clung to the valley like a veil. Elias had barely slept. He stood outside his cabin, sharpening his axe with steady, deliberate strokes. Every scrape of steel on stone rang through the trees like a warning. Bell! Behind him, the twins peered nervously from the cabin doorway, their small faces pale but defiant. Down below, the faint murmur of voices swelled into a roar. The townsfolk were coming, first in twos, then in fives, until a crowd of nearly 30 trudged up the narrow path that wound into the forest. Men carried rifles and lanterns, women clutched shawls close around their shoulders, and children trailed at the edges, eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. At the center strode the hunter, his pride bruised but his voice loud, spurring them on. "Brandt's gone soft in the head," he declared, "hiding savages in his cabin, turning his back on us. If he's protecting them, then he's no better than they are. Today we put an end to it." The crowd surged closer, their boots crunching over frost and fallen leaves. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Birds had fled, and even the wind stilled, waiting. When they reached the clearing, they saw Elias waiting. The giant lumberjack stood with his axe in hand, his frame filling the morning light. For a moment, no one spoke. His presence alone was enough to give them pause. Then the mayor stepped forward, a lean man with silver hair and sharp eyes. His voice was cold, measured. "Elias Brandt, you've harbored those children. We know it. You've defied the town, and now you'll answer for it." Elias lifted his gaze slowly. His voice was gravel, deep and steady. "They are children, alone, afraid. You call it defiance. I call it decency." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some lowered their eyes. Others tightened their grips on rifles. The hunter sneered. "Don't be fooled, Mayor. These brats aren't innocent. They'll grow into warriors, raiders. If we don't deal with them now, we'll regret it." At that, the twins stepped back in fear. Elias's jaw tightened. He let the axe fall, not into the hunter, not into the ground, but into the earth at his own feet with a heavy thud. Then, in a move that silenced the mob entirely, he turned, knelt down, and lifted the children onto his shoulders. The boy clung to one side, the girl to the other, their tiny arms wrapped around his neck. Facing the crowd, Elias stood taller than ever, his silhouette towering against the rising sun. His voice thundered across the clearing. If you want them, you'll have to go through me. And if you believe a mob with rifles has more honor than a man protecting children, then perhaps I misjudged what this town ever stood for." The words struck harder than any axe blow. The crowd faltered. Women exchanged glances, some pressing, hands to their mouths. Men shifted uneasily, shame flickering across faces. The mayor's sharp gaze softened, though he did not speak yet. The hunter, however, would not yield. Red with fury, he raised his rifle and leveled it at Elias. "Then you'll fall with them!" Gasps tore through the crowd. A woman cried out, grabbing at his arm. But before the shot could ring, Elias stepped forward, his booming voice cutting through the air. "Go on, then. Shoot. But know this, you won't just be killing me. You'll be killing the last shred of decency left in this place. And you'll live with the sight of 2 children's blood on your hands." The hunter's hand shook. His finger twitched against the trigger, but the weight of every eye upon him was heavier than any gun. Slowly, unwillingly, he lowered the weapon. Silence fell. Even the forest seemed to lean in, listening. The mayor finally stepped forward, his voice carrying a grave authority. "This has gone far enough. Elias is right. They're only children. Whatever future comes, it is not for us to destroy them before they've even had a chance to live it." Reluctantly, the crowd began to disperse, whispers rising again, but softer this time, uncertain, almost ashamed. Some nodded to Elias as they passed. Others avoided his gaze entirely. The hunter stormed away alone, his defeat stinging sharper than ever. When the clearing was empty, Elias lowered the twins gently to the ground. Their small hands clung to his arms, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and gratitude. For the first time since he'd taken them in, Elias allowed himself to breathe. He had faced the town. He had stood not as a hermit, not as a monster, but as a guardian. And though he knew more storms would come, in that moment, he had shocked the town into silence, and perhaps into reflection. Behind him, the cabin stood as it always had, sturdy and weathered. But for the first time, it felt less like a prison and more like a home. The forest awoke in a hush the morning after Elias's stand. Mist curled through the towering pines, carrying with it the echoes of what had transpired. Word of the confrontation had spread like wildfire across the valley. By noon, every house in town knew the tale. How the giant lumberjack had stood against a mob, how he had lifted 2 tiny children upon his shoulders and dared anyone to strike him down. But Elias himself cared little for the murmurs. He returned to his cabin, where the twins followed him like shadows. They no longer flinched at the creak of his boots or the rumble of his voice. Instead, they looked to him with the unspoken trust of children who knew they were safe at last. The days that followed were quiet but heavy with change. The townsfolk avoided his clearing, yet none dared confront him again. A few, emboldened by whispers of guilt, began leaving small offerings at the edge of his woods. Bread, jars of preserves, a quilt stitched by careful hands. No notes accompanied them, but Elias understood. It was not apology, not yet, but recognition. The twins blossomed under his care. The boy, once timid, began imitating Elias's steady movements, dragging small sticks across the clearing as if felling mighty trees. The girl laughed more easily now, chasing birds and returning with wildflowers she placed in a tin mug on Elias's table. At night, Elias told them stories, not of lumberjacks or axes, but of the stars, of rivers that carved valleys, of mountains that stood eternal. Yet Elias knew shadows lingered. The hunter had not forgotten his humiliation. Though the town had turned quiet, Elias sensed the man's bitterness simmering just beyond sight. Still, he did not live in fear. He had made his choice, and he would live with it, whatever storms came. One crisp evening, weeks later, the mayor himself came alone up the narrow path. He was not armed. Elias greeted him at the edge of the clearing, axe in hand, but lowered. The twins watched from the porch, clutching each other's hands. The mayor's voice was weary but sincere. "You've done what few of us had the courage to do, Elias. You reminded us that fear isn't the same as wisdom, that cruelty isn't strength." Elias said nothing at first, only studied the man. Finally, he spoke, his tone low. "I didn't set out to remind anyone of anything. I only did what any man ought to." The mayor nodded. "Perhaps. But sometimes it takes a man like you to show the rest of us what ought to looks like." He hesitated, then added, "The town won't trouble you again. And those children? They'll be welcome here if they wish it, when the time is right." Elias glanced back at the twins, their small forms framed in the doorway, and a rare softness touched his features. "They have a home here. When they're ready, they'll choose their path. Not before." The mayor inclined his head, then left the clearing, his figure soon swallowed by the trees. As the days turned into months, Elias and the twins became a story unto themselves. Travelers carried whispers of the giant lumberjack who had defied a mob to protect two fragile lives. Some called him a madman, others a saint. But to the twins, he was neither. He was simply Elias, their guardian, their giant, their family. Years later, long after the children had grown into strong, kind adults, folks still spoke of that day. Around campfires, in taverns, on porches at dusk, the tale was told. How a mob had come with rifles and rage, and how one man's choice had silenced them with nothing but his courage. Some said the forest itself remembered, that if you walked far enough into the pines, you could still hear the echo of his voice booming like thunder. "If you want them, you'll have to go through me." Elias never sought such legend. He asked for no glory, no songs, no monuments. But the story lived on, because it had touched something deeper than fear or anger. It had reminded people of humanity. And in that quiet cabin in the woods, where laughter now rose like smoke from the chimney, Elias Brandt, the giant lumberjack, finally knew peace. Not the peace of solitude, but the peace of belonging, born from the day he chose to stand when all others had turned away. The town would never forget, nor would the children. The man who shocked them all had, without meaning to, become a legend.